What if the story of your identity wasn't written in books, but in blood? What if, hidden in your DNA, there were whispers from a time before kings, before languages, even before memory? And what if I told you that some of the world's most mysterious, complex, and ancient genetic signatures live quietly inside the people of India? This isn't a theory. It's a scientific fact. And we're about to open a chapter of human history that most of the world never knew existed. When I first heard this, that Indian DNA might be more diverse than almost any population on Earth, I didn't believe it. I thought, how could that be? How could a single subcontinent carry more ancestral variation than all of Europe, or even East Asia? But the deeper I looked, the more genomes I explored, the more everything changed. There are people alive today in remote Indian villages whose DNA holds traces of ancestors that split off from the human family tree tens of thousands of years ago and never returned. Tribes whose genetic lineages are so unique, they don't even appear in global datasets. Caste groups who haven't intermarried with outsiders for over 1,900 years, preserving rare mutations, unknown combinations, and lost threads of human migration. Let me ask you this. What if your family, right now, carries a mutation found nowhere else on Earth? Wouldn't you want to know what it means? Because here's the truth. Most of the genetic maps we've relied on were drawn without Indian data, without Indian voices. Until very recently, Indian people made up less than 2% of global genetic studies. That means almost everything we thought we knew was missing one of the biggest pieces. Imagine a puzzle, a map of humanity, and one corner is blurry, empty, incomplete. That corner was India, but not anymore. In this series, we're going to uncover the secrets locked in Indian DNA. Not just the science, but the emotion, the forgotten migrations, the cultural decisions that shape biology, the diseases that linger, the adaptations that saved lives, and the hidden power written in your genome. So before we dive into this once-in-a-generation discovery, ask yourself, what if your bloodline could answer questions no historian could? What if the deepest truths about civilization, about you, were waiting inside your very cells? You're about to find out. You've heard the phrase, we're all the same under the skin. But what if I told you that in India, that's genetically not true? I remember the first time I saw a genetic map of South Asia. The scientists had plotted population clusters, like dots on a canvas, and India didn't look like a country. It looked like a galaxy. Each group, tribal, caste, regional, spinning in its own orbit, some so far apart genetically, they were as distinct from each other as a Swede is from a Korean. Let that sink in. Inside one nation, people living side by side can be genetically further apart than entire continents. Isn't that insane? But why? Why is Indian DNA so wildly fragmented? The answer begins with something astonishing. India is home to over 4,500 ethno-linguistic groups, many of which have practiced strict community boundaries for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. That means marriages for generations happened only within group lines. The result? Deep allele frequency gaps, private mutations, and a genetic structure that's more intricate than almost any other region on Earth, second only to Africa in raw diversity. And yet, despite this richness, Indian DNA is often misunderstood, or worse, oversimplified. You've probably seen those ancestry commercials. You're 20% this, 30% that. But if you plug an Indian genome into those databases, half the time it'll say unassigned or unknown. Why? Because standard models can't contain Indian complexity. Let me show you how extreme it gets. In Europe, genetic differences from Spain to Germany to Poland are minor. But in India, the DNA of one caste in Maharashtra might be less similar to its neighboring group than to people thousands of kilometers away. And it's not just language or culture, it's the genes themselves. Groups carry unique variants, some of which don't even appear in the global genetic databases built from American, European, or East Asian samples. Think about that. We've mapped the human genome, but we haven't even begun to decode the Indian genome properly. And here's where it gets personal. Some researchers used to believe India had just two ancestral components, a north and a south. But now, we know that's wrong. In fact, we're talking about dozens of ancestral streams, some of which are so old, so divergent, They had to be modeled as entirely new lineages in science. No other place has forced that level of rethinking. Here's a stat that blew me away. In the 2020 IndiGen project, when they sequenced over 1,000 Indian genomes, they found that 46% of the genetic variants had never been recorded before. Let me say that again. Nearly half the data was new to science. Why does that matter? Because if we don't understand Indian DNA, then we don't understand human evolution. Period. So here's a question for you. What happens when a population carries genetic signatures that no one else on Earth has, but science hasn't studied them yet? What are we missing? Cures? Clues? Stories? In this series, we're not just decoding mutations. We're uncovering a hidden library of ancestry, and India may hold chapters no one has read in 40,000 years. You think you know your roots? You've barely scratched the surface. I'll never forget the moment I first read it. A single sentence buried deep in a genetics paper. The two primary ancestral groups in India are as different from each other as Europeans are from East Asians. Wait, what? How could two groups living in the same country be that genetically distant? And that's when I discovered something few outside the scientific world ever talk about. The primal split inside Indian DNA. The divide between the ancestral North Indians and the ancestral South Indians. Or, more accurately, ANI and ASI. Let me take you there. Thousands of years ago, before borders, before temples, before the idea of India even existed, two major human populations were living on this land. The first, the ANI, carried ancestry from the West, related to ancient Iranians, Central Asians, and eventually the Yamnaya steppe nomads, who reshaped Eurasia. The second was entirely different. The ASI, or more precisely, ASI, the ancient ancestral South Indians, were indigenous to this land. Not just early settlers, but descendants of one of the earliest waves of humans to leave Africa, more than 60,000 years ago. Their DNA doesn't closely match anyone outside the subcontinent. Not Europeans, not East Asians, not even modern Africans. In fact, the only surviving people with similar ancestry, the isolated Andamanese tribes, people like the Anj, who've lived for millennia on islands cut off from the mainland, preserving fragments of that ancient code. So when scientists model Indian DNA today, they're not just tracing back thousands of years. They're staring into the deep past of humanity itself. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. Every Indian alive today, whether Brahmin or Bhil, Bengali or Tamil, carries a blend of both ANI and ASI. No one is pure or anything, but the proportions vary wildly, depending on geography, caste, and history. Northern populations generally have more ANI, a heavier imprint of West Eurasian genes. Southern and tribal populations often carry more ASI, stronger threads of deep, indigenous ancestry. But that's not the full picture, because this mixture didn't happen overnight. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't simple. It was shaped by thousands of years of migration, collapse, conquest, intermarriage, and then, suddenly, genetic silence. More on that later. For now, imagine what it means to have two ancestral streams flowing through your blood, one that once crossed the mountains from Iran, and one that has been rooted in this land since the Ice Age. Who else can say that? Which other population holds that combination? This is why India defies all genetic assumptions. It's not just that its people are diverse, it's that their very origins come from lineages so deep, so globally unique, they force science to redraw the entire map. Here's a thought. If your ancestors were both travelers and natives, where does your story really begin? That's the question Indian DNA is still trying to answer. And we're just getting started. Close your eyes for a second. Picture ancient South Asia, not as one country, but as a crossroads, a living highway of humanity. Long before history books began, people were already arriving here from every direction. From the west came farmers carrying seeds of wheat and barley, the first whispers of agriculture. From the north, waves of horseback riders thundered down from the wind-swept grasslands of Central Asia. And from the east, forest-dwelling migrants brought language and rice from what we now call Southeast Asia. Now here's the part that blew my mind. These weren't just travelers. They were carriers of entire genetic worlds. And when they arrived, they didn't just settle. They mixed, but not like ingredients in a soup. More like tectonic plates colliding. The DNA of modern Indians is the result of layered admixture events, stacked over thousands of years. Each layer a story. Each story a disruption. Let's break it down. Around 9,000 years ago, a wave of Neolithic farmers moved into the subcontinent from the Iranian plateau. But they didn't replace the locals. Instead, they intermarried with ancient hunter-gatherers, people whose ancestry had been rooted in South Asia for tens of thousands of years. This fusion laid the foundation for what would become one of the most advanced early civilizations on Earth, the Indus Valley Civilization. But the story doesn't end there. Because just as the Indus cities began to decline, around 2000 BCE, a new force was entering from the northwest. Pastoral nomads from the Central Asian steppe, tall, warrior herders with chariots and fire temples, moved in. These were the carriers of a new language family, the early Indo-Europeans. Their DNA brought a strong West Eurasian component, radically different from the Indus farmers and native ASI peoples. And here's the twist. For decades, the debate raged. Were these invasions? Migrations? Cultural exchanges? But now, genetics has answered what archaeology could not. Ancient DNA tells us there was mixing. Profound, population-wide mixing. Especially in the north. So by 1500 BCE, India wasn't a melting pot. It was a stratified mosaic. Some regions had absorbed multiple waves of newcomers. Others had remained more genetically intact. But it didn't stop. Southeast Asian influence crept in through the forests of Bengal and Odisha. Austroasiatic-speaking tribes like the Munda brought with them a genetic fingerprint that still echoes in central India today. Farther northeast, Tibeto-Burman speakers arrived and left behind alleles associated with East Asian facial and dental traits, like the famous EDAR gene. Imagine the timeline. 9,000 years ago, Iranian farmers. 4,500 years ago, Indus Valley DNA. 3,500 years ago, steppe ancestry. And from the east, gene flow that added traits found nowhere else in South Asia. Now here's the kicker. By around 2,000 years ago, most Indian populations had absorbed their full ancestral blend. They became part of what geneticists call the Indian cline, a gradient of ancestry stretching from West Eurasian rich north to ASI heavy south. But then everything froze. That's coming in the next section. For now, consider this. If your DNA could be mapped like tree rings, each ancestral layer would tell a story of migration, survival, and transformation. How many stories are hiding in your blood? And how many of them were never written down? There's a point in every story where motion stops. The music fades. And everything changes. In the story of Indian DNA, that moment came just under 2,000 years ago. For tens of thousands of years, the subcontinent had been alive with genetic motion. Waves of farmers, tribes, traders, nomads, all intermingling, shaping one of the most complex genomes on the planet. But then the doors closed. Across regions, languages, and social lines, the rule became simple. Marry your own. Stay within your kind. Do not mix. This was the birth of genetic endogamy, powered by one of the most rigid social systems ever constructed, the caste system. And its effect on DNA was nothing short of revolutionary. Before this freeze, Indian communities were part of a fluid, evolving mosaic. After it, they became genetic islands, cut off, isolated, each drifting on its own. Now here's the part that hits hard. Scientists can actually see the moment this freeze occurred. They've run the numbers on mitochondrial DNA, on autosomal segments, on identity bidescent markers, and almost all major Indian groups show signs of intense mixing between 4,200 and 1,900 years ago, followed by a sudden, sharp stop. Why does that matter? Because in genetic terms, this stop froze ancient history into the present. Every village, every caste, every tribe became a closed system. Mutations began to build. Rare variants became common, not because of nature, but because of marriage laws. Let me give you a visual. Imagine two rivers flowing together for centuries, and then someone builds a dam. On both sides, the waters start evolving on their own, growing different algae, different minerals, different life. That's exactly what happened to Indian DNA. And the consequences? They're still unfolding in the bodies of more than 1 billion people. Some communities carry genetic diseases seen nowhere else in the world, trapped by isolation, amplified by generations of intergroup marriage. Others have preserved adaptations and mutations so specific. They tell stories of ancient migrations that happened before writing even existed. You know what's wild? Two people living on the same street in modern India, maybe just separated by caste, could have genetic differences greater than someone from Ireland and Turkey. Think about that. This isn't just about biology. It's about memory. It's about how a society's rules can shape what future generations inherit, not just culturally, but in their cells. And here's the part that haunts me the most. This isolation didn't happen because of war, or famine, or climate collapse. It happened because of belief, because of a constructed system, of purity, of hierarchy, that decided who was allowed to love whom. And once that belief took root, it rewired the gene pool of an entire civilization. So now I ask you, if the caste system could alter the course of DNA, what else could it be affecting? And how many medical mysteries, how many forgotten migrations, how many unseen stories still lie coded in the genomes of people who were never meant to mix? We're not just talking about ancestry. We're talking about a locked vault of biological history. And in the next part, we're going to open it. What if your ancestors didn't just pass down their names and languages, but actual survival instructions, written directly into your genes? What if, over centuries, your DNA had learned to adapt, not just to the terrain beneath your feet, but to the food on your plate, the air in your lungs, the rituals you kept? Because in India, that's not just a theory. It's a documented reality. Let me tell you a story that changed how I see evolution. A few years ago, geneticists studying a specific enzyme found something bizarre. A tiny 22 base pair insertion in the FADS2 gene, present in striking numbers among Indian populations. At first, it looked like a quirk, but then it clicked. That single mutation helped people digest plant-based diets more efficiently. It allowed the body to convert plant oils into vital long-chain fatty acids, compounds essential for brain function and immune health. In short, it was a genetic upgrade, a direct response to centuries of vegetarian culture. Not by chance, but by natural selection. Think about that. A religious and ethical choice, practiced over generations, had literally reshaped metabolism. And it doesn't stop there. In pastoral communities of Western and Northern India, another pattern appears. People here often carry the lactase persistence allele, a rare mutation that allows adults to digest milk. Globally, most adults lose this ability after childhood. But in India, if your ancestors depended on cattle, not just for meat, but for milk, evolution gave you a gift, the ability to keep drinking it for life. And that's not the only battlefield where genes were forced to adapt. Let's talk about malaria. In forested, humid zones, especially in tribal belts across central and eastern India, malaria has been an ancient killer. But Indian DNA fought back. One of the most powerful weapons? The sickle cell trait, a mutation that changes the shape of red blood cells. Carriers of this mutation are less likely to die from severe malaria. It's a brutal trade-off, because in homozygous form, it causes sickle cell disease. But for centuries, in small, isolated communities, it saved lives. And it wasn't the only tool. Another adaptation, called G6PD deficiency, appears in high frequency in some Indian populations. It can cause complications, but it also provides resistance to the same deadly parasite. Can you see the pattern? Indian DNA is not passive. It remembers struggle and rewires itself in response. Even the Himalayas have left their mark. In regions like Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh, geneticists found high-altitude adaptations identical to those in Tibetans, variants in genes like EPS1, helping the body cope with oxygen-starved air. These variants weren't invented in India. They were borrowed through ancient interbreeding with already adapted populations. A genetic shortcut to survival, encoded in the blood of people who've lived at 15,000 feet for generations. Now here's the twist. These adaptations were once life-saving, but in today's world, they come with consequences. Take metabolism, for instance. Variants like DOK5 and MSDN, shaped to store fat efficiently in lean environments, are now linked to insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes in modern Indians, who often show higher disease risk at lower body weights. It's the paradox of evolution. What once saved us may now be making us sick. But it also means this: to understand Indian health, from heart disease to obesity, we must understand the evolutionary history behind the genome. Because no two adaptations are random. Each one is a record of climate, of culture, of survival, and most importantly, of choices made, generation after generation. So here's the question. What does your DNA say about how your ancestors lived? What did they eat? What did they fight? What did they endure? And how many of those answers are still living inside your body without you even knowing? We've talked about where the Indian genome came from. Now it's time to ask, what price did it pay to get here? Because hidden inside this ancient, rich, and adaptive DNA is a darker inheritance, one that science is only now beginning to fully grasp. The cost of genetic isolation. Here's a truth that caught me off guard. In many Indian communities, especially those that have remained endogamous for centuries, there's a silent risk building with every generation: the rise of recessive genetic diseases. How? Let's rewind to something simple. Imagine a small group of people founding a village. They marry only within their group. Over time, certain rare mutations, harmless in one copy, begin to concentrate. And if two carriers have a child, that child may inherit both copies of the faulty gene. The result? Inherited disease. And in India, this isn't hypothetical. It's reality. It's measurable. It's happening. Take this. In a large-scale genetic survey of Indian populations, researchers found stunning levels of identity by descent, meaning people within the same group often share large, identical stretches of DNA from a common ancestor. In some communities, over 1,000 unique, potentially damaging mutations were discovered, exclusive to that group, not found in neighboring populations, not found anywhere else in the world. These aren't just numbers. These are real families, real diagnoses, real heartbreak. Now let me tell you about one particular mutation, one that scientists call the MYBPC3 delta 25BP deletion. It affects a gene critical to your heart's function. In most of the world, it's nearly absent. But in India, up to 8% of the population may carry it. That's tens of millions of people. The danger? Many carriers are healthy, until one day, their heart begins to fail, often with no warning. For some, it's fatal in their 30s or 40s. And most have no idea they carry this risk. Why? Because we haven't looked. Because for too long, Indian genetics has been understudied, underfunded, and underprioritized, even by global medicine. But here's what's changing that. Recent genome projects, like IndiGen and Genome India, are finally exposing these hidden fault lines. They're showing that Indian DNA is a minefield of population-specific mutations that we need to understand, not just for ancestry, but for survival. And this problem doesn't stop with heart disease. Across India, isolated populations show higher rates of rare neurological disorders, blood diseases, metabolic conditions, all rooted in genetic bottlenecks. Ever heard of a disease that only exists in one village? In India, that's not folklore. That's science. But here's the twist you didn't see coming. Some of these same founder mutations that increase disease risk may also protect against ancient threats. We've seen how sickle cell carriers resist malaria. We've seen how G6PD deficiency was selected for survival, even as it brings complications. It's a delicate balance. Evolution's cruel gamble. So the question becomes, which mutations are your shield and which ones are your time bomb? And how many people walk through life carrying a dangerous gene, simply because their ancestors were told to marry within, century after century? This is no longer just about history. It's about diagnosis, about personalized medicine, about rewriting how healthcare works in a country of 1.4 billion people. Because until we decode these founder effects, until we bring Indian genetics fully into the light, millions will remain vulnerable. And the saddest part? They won't even know it. What if the answers to your identity were never written in ink, but encoded in silence? What if your family tree didn't grow from stories, but from strands of DNA quietly passed down for 10,000 generations? And what if, somewhere in your genome, there was a fragment so rare, no one else alive might carry it? This isn't a metaphor. It's real. Because Indian DNA isn't just unique. It's a living archive of human history. Every gene, every allele, every rare variant tells a different story. A story of farmers who crossed deserts to plant the first seeds of civilization, of nomads who raced through mountain passes on horseback, bringing new bloodlines and languages, of forgotten tribes who shaped this land in silence, long before history had a name, and then of societies that chose, consciously, to stop the mixing, to preserve what was already ancient. Some of those choices saved lives, others locked in risk. All of them shaped you. But here's what most people don't realize. Science is only now beginning to catch up with the complexity of Indian DNA. Until recently, your genome, your actual genetic blueprint, was left out of global research, which means your story has barely begun to be told. Ask yourself, do you really know what you're made of? Not just the region, not just the caste, not just the culture, but the mutations, the adaptations, the migrations, the decisions your ancestors made that now live in your body? Because that's the thing. DNA isn't just about the past. It's about the future. It decides how you process food, how your body fights disease, how you react to medicine. And yet, billions of people in South Asia still don't have access to personalized genetics, still don't know the silent risks, still don't know what makes them biologically different and incredibly valuable. So what happens next? That's up to us. We're standing at the edge of a revolution in medicine, in ancestry, in understanding who we are. But that revolution is incomplete without India. Because Indian DNA doesn't just belong in textbooks. It belongs at the center of global science, discovery, and healing. So here's what you can do right now. Ask questions. Be curious. Look into your ancestry. Not for entertainment, but for insight, for health, for your legacy. And if this journey moved you, if it made you think, made you feel, made you want to know more, then don't keep it to yourself. Like this video. Share it. Start a conversation in the comments. Tell us, what do you think your DNA remembers that history forgot? Because the truth is, the story of Indian DNA isn't finished. It's just getting started. And it starts with you.